he mentions, and also he mentions in Al-Arba'in fi Usul al-Din, which is like a condensed summary of the Ihya. And he wrote it after Ihya Ulumuddin. He speaks about that the teacher, the rights of the teacher come before the rights of the parent. And this is something that is often confused. Imam al-Ghazali says in Ihya Ulumuddin, the reason that the rights of the teacher become before the rights of the parent, because the parent was the cause through which the individual came to life. This is the cause subhanahu wa ta'ala created for the child to come into being, biologically speaking. So the parent becomes a cause created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the child to come from non-existence into dunya. And he says, but the Shaykh, al-alim, the scholar, is the cause by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings this individual from the dunya to the akhirah, meaning to the realm of command, to alam al-amr, to proximity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So from that sense, he says the teacher has greater right upon the student than the parent would have over the child, because after all, the parent was responsible for the biology, for the nutrition of the body. But the Shaykh is responsible for the nutrition of the spirit. And the spirit has much greater preference in our tradition over the body. Yes, the body is not neglected, it is respected, but we are spirits that have bodies, not bodies that have spirits. I think you guys know this by now. I mentioned it in a number of classes through that trick questions when I ask you, can you say that we are, that we have bodies that have spirits? And many people would say yes. And then we would say it's the other way around. We're spirits that have bodies, because the spirits existed prior to the bodies. And the spirits ontologically, meaning in the hierarchy of existence, they're above the bodies. And the bodies are substituted. So this is not the same body that would exist in the akhirah, but it's the same spirit. So from that sense, Imam al-Ghazali says the scholar should be given more right, or is owed more right than the parent. Why? The scholar nurtures your spirit, meanwhile the parent nurtures your body. And the parent is responsible to bring you to the dunya, and the Shaykh is responsible to bring you to the akhirah. Yet, I chose to delay the etiquettes of the scholars after the etiquettes related to treatment of parents. And there is a reason behind that. Imam al-Ghazali, when he speaks about scholars, there is a certain distinction, a certain categorization that he has in mind that you ought to be aware of when you speak about this topic. Sayyid al-Habib Umar, and I think I mentioned that in previous classes, Sayyid al-Habib Umar, when he was asked a question related to teachers and so on and so forth, he said, there are 3 types of teachers. And I think this is a distinction that every Muslim should know. 3 types of teachers. Sometimes they are present in one. Sometimes 2 of them are present in one. Sometimes the 3 are present in one. But there isn't a necessary relationship between the 3. Okay? So the first type, we call him Shaykh Ilm. This is a teacher of science. When we say science, we don't mean empirical sciences. This is not your Shaykh in biology, chemistry, STEM, mathematics and stuff like that. No, Shaykh Ilm, meaning this is someone who dispenses knowledge of the sciences, of the sacred sciences. The second category, I'll go through each, but after mentioning the three. So what is the first type? Shaykh ilm, someone who dispenses knowledge. Second is a shaykh tarbiyah. This is someone that gives advice, provides consultation, someone who speaks about the spiritual diseases, the diseases of the heart, envy, arrogance, self-boasting, stinginess, speaks about reliance upon Allah, tawakkul, speaks about patience, perseverance, speaks about gratitude. So this is someone that nurtures the soul and the spirit, but this is not necessarily a shaykh of a Sufi path. طيب? The third type, they call him Shaykh Fath, the shaykh of opening, meaning spiritual opening. And this is, in principle, is the Sufi master. So when Imam al-Ghazali speaks about that the Shaykh has more right upon the student than a parent upon the child, which Shaykh of the three is he talking about? The third. The third. Not the first, not the second. Right? Because he is the one that has that condition of what? Bringing the individual from the dunya to the akhirah. Right? And nurtures the spirit in the truest sense. Right? Now we have a problem nowadays that people don't distinguish between the three. If we zoom in the first category, which is what? Shaykh ilm, someone who dispenses knowledge. Also, this type of scholar or shaykh or teacher, they come in different ranks. What are the ranks? Depending on the nobility of the science that they dispense. Right? So a teacher that teaches worldly science or a natural science versus a teacher that teaches a sacred science. A teacher that teaches an auxiliary science like Arabic, logic, etiquette of debate, versus someone that teaches fiqh and hadith and tafsir. So you have to distinguish between the ranks, not depending on the individual, but depending on the nobility of the science that is being dispensed. Because part of that honoring, part of that respect is actually related to, or you could say even the majority of that respect and honor is the honor of that knowledge that that person is carrying. Right? Some of the fuqaha, they speak about, we mentioned that in the fiqh class the other day. Some of the fuqaha, they speak about how the books, when you place them in your library, on the bookshelves, you ought to maintain a certain hierarchy. So the books of tafsir should be on the top shelf, books of hadith come afterwards, books of literature should be beneath, and so on and so forth. Depending on what? Depending on how many Quranic verses are existent in these volumes. And also depending on what? On the nobility of each science, and the sciences gain their nobility from their subject matter. So the more noble the subject matter is, the more noble the science is. Right? So tafsir is one of the most noble sciences. Why? Because it has to do with what? With knowing the meanings of the words of Allah. Creed would be more noble than tafsir because it has to do with the attributes of Allah. See? So there's a certain hierarchy in terms of the nobility of the sciences, depending on the nobility of the subject. And that would, in sense, would translate as well in terms of the honoring and the respect of the scholars, based on what? Based on the knowledge that they carry. So the honor is the honor of the knowledge that they carry, right? طيب. So nowadays, many people, they don't discern, they don't distinguish between the types of scholars, right? And a lot of problems nowadays happen when people are not aware of this kind of categorization, because there are certain rights of each of these scholars. So for example, the scholar who is, we said, we type the Shaykh of what? The Shaykh of Fath, of opening. Now the Shaykh of Fath, you would find in the Sufi textbooks, in the Sufi manuals, about the etiquette with the Shaykh, they would say that the student, the murid, that's how they would title him, the seeker, would be with the Shaykh as a dead body with the person who's doing the washing. كالميت بين يدي الغسال. So the person who's doing the washing, they flip the deceased person to their right side. He wouldn't say, oh, I don't like my right side. Please allow me to go my left side first. No. They don't really have a will or a choice or a preference when it comes to the preference of the person who's doing the washing. And this is such a how would I describe this? I mean, it's a certain state, right? A spiritual state, a spiritual mindset that the individual is not supposed to allow to anyone, right? After all, also you have to keep in mind, the Shaykh of Fath, the individual goes to them for that Fath, for that opening, right? What we see nowadays is that people go to, for example, to Sufi tariqas, and they go to the Shaykh thinking that the Shaykh is a fixer. The Shaykh will fix their life, will allow them to have a better job, marry the woman they want, they wish to marry. You know, if they're not having children, they're gonna make dua and they will have children. Shaykh is a fixer, right? If they have a psychological problem, the Shaykh will fix the psychological problem. And I have seen many conundrums happening because of the murids going to the Shaykh and not really distinguishing whom they're dealing with. And then it becomes even more problematic when the Shaykh believes himself, because he finds flocks of people coming at him thinking, what? You're our master. And people are all revealing the secrets, the inner secrets of their houses, of their households. Oh, I have this problem with my wife. Oh, I have this problem with my husband. I have this problem with my children. And everybody is like giving, you know, all of the inner secrets of their lives, while the individual still himself needs tarbiyah. He's not a Shaykh Fath. And the Shaykh of Fath as well, this is someone that when you decide, you say, I need a Shaykh, a Sufi master, so to speak, this is when the individual has been already carrying out the obligations and most of the sunan. And you're like, now I want to dedicate my life to spirituality. If the Shaykh tells me, leave behind your Ferrari, I would leave my Ferrari. Just like Sayyidi Ali al-Khawas did with whom? Did with Sayyidi Abdul Wahab al-Sha'rani. Sayyidi Abdul Wahab al-Sha'rani went to him as an acknowledged, published scholar from the Azhar milieu, so to speak. Shafi'i tradition, studied with great scholars. If you read, there's a book, I'm not sure it's translated, called Al-Minan, the Blessings. Imam Suyuti just goes through, and he wrote 3 volumes. Al-Minan al-Kubra, al-Sughra, al-Wusta. He goes detailing, some of them are 3 volumes, detailing all of the blessings of Allah upon him. He has a section, the blessings of Allah, when it comes to the books that he read and the books that he owned and the shuyukh that he studied with. And then he goes to Shaykh Ali Khawas and he says, Shaykh, he's a distinguished scholar. He says, and Shaykh Ali Khawas is illiterate. He doesn't read or write. Huh? He's a great Sufi saint. And he says, Shaykh Ali Khawas, Sidi Ali, I want to seek the path. He goes, can I see your books? Looks at them. You want to seek the path? Yes. Throw them in the Nile. What do you mean throw them? He said, wash them in the Nile. So what do you mean wash them? He said, there is no sincerity in them. Wash them. كالميت بين يدي الغسال, like a dead corpse in the hands of a washer. حاضر. Wash them. He washed all of his books and then started to rewrite again. Every time he would show Shaykh Ali Khawas the book, he say, no, not fully sincere yet. Until the moment he said, khalas, sincere. But he went as again, I'm not trying to say that it's incumbent upon the murid to be an established scholar. That's not necessary. But what I'm saying, this is the type of relationship. This is the type of relationship. Now it becomes problematic when it happens from a sheikh or the students around a sheikh, where they start referring to a sheikh of ilm, of science, or a sheikh of tarbiyah as if he's a sheikh of fath. Then people start treating him as Sayyid Abdullah al-Sha'rani is treating whom? Sayyid Ali Khawas. And unfortunately, sometimes you find within certain Sufi circles, they would be speaking to the sheikh as if he's a sheikh of fath, while he's not. So people go, treat him as such. On one hand, he is not at that level of sainthood or scholarship or gnosis, of knowledge, nor that they are actual murids. They could be beginners, they're still struggling with their 5 salawat. You don't, if you're struggling with the 5 salawat, don't go to a sheikh and tell him, give me awrad. Just ask him, Sheikh, I'm struggling with the 5 salawat. Huh? If you're struggling with the sunans, don't tell him, Sheikh, I want to go to khalwa. What are you talking about? What khalwa? Do the sunans and then khalwa will come if it comes. See? So this is, again, someone who says, and this is why I mentioned this before, one of the most absolute essential traits for a Muslim and for a human being. Successful life, you gotta be truthful with yourself. Be sadiq with yourself. If you're not fully dedicated to Allah, don't say, oh, I'm dedicated to Allah, because then you'll be examined. Are you really dedicated to Allah or not? So don't make claims about, oh, I'm dedicated. طيب. So the reason I went through this breakdown is just to let you know that when Imam al-Ghazali, when he mentioned the etiquettes of the scholar and the teacher before the parents, this is the background. He's talking about whom? Talking about the Shaykh of Fath. Yes, that Shaykh is higher in rank than the parent. But not every Shaykh is higher than the parent. In fact, if you find the Shaykh that teaches you fiqh or theology or even basics of tazkiyah, like Bidayat al-Hidayah, or even teaches things that are related to spirituality, and is demanding from you more attention than the attention that you ought to give to your parents, that becomes a red flag. Because real teachers would say what? Even the Shaykh of Fath, by the way, if they find you negligent with your parent, he'll tell you, don't come to my class, attend to your parents. Because they're inheritors of the Prophet ﷺ. The companion came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, O Messenger of Allah, I pledge allegiance to migrate and to join with you in the battles. What did the Prophet ﷺ say to him? Do you have parents? I do. Well, struggle in your service of them. Right? This is what the Prophet ﷺ said. But you would find nowadays, unfortunately, some Shia from their parents. Then they would serve their parent. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. The Shaykh, just like the Prophet ﷺ said to the companion, what? Do you have a mother? Yes, I have. Serve her. See? So this is why I delay scholars and students till after we cover the etiquettes of parents, so that you would understand when Imam al-Ghazali structured it, he had in mind the Sufi master, who is truly has more right than a parent for the reasons that we mentioned, which is nurturing of the spirit over nurturing of the body, and bringing the individual into the divine hadra, to proximity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes the parent would bring the individual to the dunya. The teacher may teach the son or their student or the murid how to forgive and let go. The parents say, no, fight for your right. Different orientations. It doesn't mean that the parents are wrong. This is their job. And the teacher has a different job than that. طيب. So he says etiquettes of a scholar. Note that he began with the etiquettes of the scholar, not with the etiquettes of the student. He says, if you're a scholar, then know that the etiquettes of the scholar include, number one, forbearance and constant clemency. Where does he take that from? He takes that from the Prophet ﷺ, forbearance. How the Prophet ﷺ had the patience with the disbelievers of Mecca. I shared the story, the last Friday khutbah, of the Prophet ﷺ. It's a beautiful narration, subhanAllah, it's in Sahih Bukhari, of the and it's narrated by Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas through Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab, when he saw the Prophet ﷺ coming to pray over Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. Now, Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul is the head of the hypocrites in Medina. He is the one that was, you could say, fighting the believers emotionally and psychologically after the Battle of Uhud, after the defeat. And he is the one that said, when we return to the Medina, the more honorable will repel the weaker, referring to himself as the more honorable, and referring to the Prophet ﷺ. He's far removed from what Ibn Salul said, referring to the Prophet ﷺ as the weaker. Right? So this is someone that is, by consensus, he's a hypocrite. Staunch hypocrite. Every single way he could find to attack, to cause any kind of harm to the believers, he would do. He would forge, agreements with the disbelievers of the different tribes. All of his wrongdoings are well documented. So now he passes away. Everyone knows from the companions, this guy showed himself as a Muslim, but in his heart, he was a disbeliever. Right? He made every proof of it. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he's supposed to be, this is his funeral before he gets buried. And the Prophet ﷺ stands up to do what? To pray upon Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. Sayyidina Umar, being Sayyidina Umar, comes to the Prophet ﷺ and starts to pull him from his, aside. Ya Rasulullah, this guy, remember, he said on that day such and such. This guy on that day, he said such and such. This guy did such and such. So the Prophet ﷺ looked to him and smiled, and he said, خلي عني يا عمر. Stand away, Umar. And the Prophet ﷺ chose to pray over him. Afterwards, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed that the Prophet ﷺ, that the ruling would be not to pray upon the hypocrites. But the Prophet ﷺ said to Sayyidina Umar, he said, if I know that if I seek forgiveness more than 70 times, he would be forgiven, I would have done so. To the point that Sayyidina Umar, towards at the very end of this narration, he goes like, I was astonished from my boldness with the Prophet ﷺ, and Allah and His Messenger know best. Narrated in the conclusion of this entire story. So perhaps this is why from an event like this, Imam Ghazali started with the etiquettes of scholarship about what? About forbearance. And note, he did not mention when he's speaking about the etiquettes of scholarship, he didn't speak about the scientific level, which books that this person has finished and so on and so forth. Again, why? Because of what I mentioned prior. Imam Ghazali is here speaking about the alim as in the truest sense of alim, meaning alim billah, knower of Allah. Then he says, sitting with dignity upon the manner of reverence with a lowered head. So you could see he started with something that is internal, and then he speaks about something that is external that speaks about an internal reality. With the lowered head, this is of the shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, abstaining from arrogance toward all people except when confronting oppressors, and that only to deter them from their wrongdoing. I want to say something here though. When he says abstaining from arrogance toward all people, and then he says except when confronting oppressors, I think I've touched upon this in other classes, maybe to different groups. Habib Ali once spoke to us about something. Perhaps one of the, I consider it as one of the most profound lessons in spirituality that I ever learned. He says, sometimes what the individual acts upon is coming from the soul, not the spirit. It's a bit subtle in spirituality, but wallahi, if you understand it and you apply it in your life, you will benefit because it's such a subtlety in understanding the self. And he gave us two examples. One example is being angry for the sake of Allah. He says, being angry for the sake of Allah, anger can come from the soul and anger can come from the spirit. And there is a sign through which you can know the anger. Is it coming from the soul or is it coming from the spirit? How do you know the difference? The anger that is from the soul, there is a for the soul in what it is angry about. There's hadh nafs. It has a share, a desire of sorts. This is number one. Two, that the anger that is from the soul, it doesn't stop when the individual apologizes. It continues on. Meanwhile, the anger that is from the spirit, it is only for the sake of Allah, not when the individual's right is transgressed. Number two, when the individual apologizes, it stops immediately. Meaning the person would not go on to say, oh, remember when you have done such and such. No, khalas, it's as if it never happened. If they apologized, then they apologized. Number three, while the anger that comes from the spirit, while the individual is externally assertive, from the inside, they have gentleness and mercy towards the individual. And that would show that between them and Allah, they would pray for that individual. They might see the individual and they would be very assertive with the person. But behind their back, they have gentleness for them. They might even cry over the fact that this individual is doing such and such. But the anger that is from the soul, when they are not with the individual, they have an inner burning, inner anger towards the individual. So this is a sign that there is a lower self. Right? Now it becomes problematic when that person whom you're angry with did actually a wrongdoing. There is a wrongdoing that happened from their side. And let's say that this wrongdoing is something that is, like it's a clear sin, for example, or it's a clear mistake, a clear error. Right? So would your anger be for the sake of Allah, or would your anger be for the sake of your lower self? So Habib Ali told us of these conditions. If the person apologizes and you continue on, then this is from the lower self. It's not from the spirit. If you feel heated all the time, if there's an inner heat and there isn't a subtle gentleness for the person, then this is a sign that it's coming from the soul. And then sometimes there are other signs. If you're more inclined to correct an individual if they're famous, for example. Meanwhile, if someone is not famous, you wouldn't be that angry. So there is a hidden envy there. And then the lower self would guise it. Would say, oh, you're angry for what reason? You're angry because they are popular, and now when they make a mistake, more people would follow their mistake. So this is how the lower self would guise things. طيب. This was the first example that he gave us of an emotion like anger. This emotion can be rooted in the soul, or it can be rooted in the spirit. When I say soul here, meaning the self, or the lower self per se. The second example is empathy. Empathy can come from the spirit and come from the soul. And he gave us an example of someone who is very brutal, very aggressive, someone who has no problem of taking people's rights in his work, whatever it may be. And then they go back home, they're having dinner, they turn on and they see a woman, a child on news, and they're suffering for whatever reason, and then they start to cry because they're affected by what they see. Yeah. So Habib Ali says, when they cry, they're not lying. They are not lying. They have a soft spot in their soul, not their spirit. There is part in their nafs, not the ruh. Part in their nafs, in the soul, that has some fragility, tenderness. So when it sees something like that, it gets affected. And when the person cries, they're sincere, they're not faking the tears. There's no one who is with them anyways. But their soul, their lower self, controls their spirit. Their spirit is not strong enough. So when it comes to a decision that they have a desire versus the Sharia, they would not choose the Sharia, they would choose their desire. It's just that on television, there isn't a conflict of interest. So that fragility of the soul permeates to their external self, and they cry. But when there is a conflict of interest, their soul overpowers their spirit. That negativity or that corrupted aspect within them overpowers their spirit. So knowing this distinction, that emotions can sometimes come from the soul and sometimes can come from the heart or the spirit. طيب. So where Imam Ghazali says, abstaining from arrogance toward our people is confronting oppressors. Now you know. Now you can understand this. When they confront oppressors, are they confronting them from the spirit or confronting them from the soul, from the lower self? Which one? One of the ways to know is when they confront the oppressors. Unfortunately, we had people, scholars in terms of knowledge, for the most part. We can have some critiques about their scholarship, but they are considered as scholars. When they met with certain presidents of Arab regimes, while those presidents were well established in their political position, they had no problem with them. They praised them. They met with them. No worries. It's all good to meet those presidents and government officials. Once there is a revolution against them, they come out on television attacking those presidents. And when you ask them why you do such a thing, I'm confronting the oppressor. But you're confronting the oppressor when the oppressor is weak. But when the oppressor was strong, you couldn't do that. So that is a sign of what? That the confronting of the oppressor is not from the spirit. Had you really wanted to confront the oppressor, confront them when they're well established, when they're strong, when they're standing on their feet. Number two, that they would not publicize that confrontation. The Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, he said, أفضل الجهاد, the best of jihad. كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر, a word of truth to a tyrant. Now the Prophet ﷺ said, he actually said عند سلطان جائر. He didn't say li sultan. Li sultan would be translated to a tyrant. عند meaning like there's a proximity when the person is saying it, meaning not publicizing it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran to Sayyidina Harun, to Sayyidina Musa and Sayyidina Harun, when they went to Fir'aun, فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا, speak to Fir'aun a gentle word. And when they spoke to Fir'aun, they didn't address him in public, they addressed him privately. So some people misunderstand these sort of phrases in the textbooks. Number 4, it said preferring humility in public gatherings and assemblies. This is pretty much straightforward. He says preferring humility in public gatherings and assemblies. The reason he said in like this qualifier in public gatherings and assemblies, because this is where everyone is watching and everyone is seeing, and this is the spotlight, and this is where people would want to get acknowledged, and so on and so forth. Refraining from jest and frivolity. I think some of these meanings we sort of covered when we spoke about forbearance. Being gentle with a student. Being patient with a haughty. Again, these sort of meanings we sort of went through more or less, at least implicitly. Now he says, rectifying the slow-witted through kind instruction without frustration or rebuke. There's an example that Imam al-Rabi' ibn Sulaiman, one of the close students of Imam al-Shafi'i, he was attending a class of Imam al-Shafi'i, and Imam al-Shafi'i explained something and he said, I don't understand. So Imam al-Shafi'i repeated it again. And they counted the times that Imam al-Shafi'i re-explained the subject. It was 40 times. And then Rabi' ibn Sulaiman was embarrassed, so he left the class. He says, I still don't understand it, I'm leaving. So later Imam Shafi'i went to his house, had a private class with him until he understood it. And then he told him, Oh Rabi', if I can feed you knowledge, I would do it. So this is the level of keenness to explain to the student and having the patience of explaining, once and twice and thrice and so on and so forth, up to 40 times. This is very important. Never feeling too proud to say, I don't know. Imam Malik it was mentioned that he was asked 30 plus questions or 40 questions. He said in 30 of them, I can't remember the exact number, but in an overwhelming majority of the questions, he would say, I don't know. And Imam Malik is Imam Malik. And he never started to teach until 70-something teachers gave him ijazah to teach. And yet, 20 questions out of 30 or 30 out of 40, he says, I don't know. People now have a difficulty with saying, I don't know. There's obviously a number of reasons why people struggle with saying, I don't know. Some of them are spiritual, and they're a bit obvious, which is eluded here, where Imam Ghazali says, never feeling too proud. But there is also another issue, which it's all boiled to too proud. But sometimes you would not necessarily find yourself say, oh, I don't say I don't know because I'm too proud. It's difficult for the soul or upon the individual to admit that they're too proud. So there are signs, clearer signs than ujb. And when I say clearer, see, Habib Ali told me that he asked Habib Umar. He said, oh Habib, and astaghfirullah from saying Habib Ali. I mean, it happened. Habib Ali told me, but now I felt when I said told me, it was a bit of boasting. Astaghfirullah. So he mentioned that he asked Habib Umar, he said, oh Habib, I reflected and contemplated, and I came to the conclusion that the subtlety of ujb, of self-boasting, is more than the subtlety of arrogance within the heart. So Habib Umar told him, yes, you're correct. And then Habib Ali told him, and I reflected upon the types of reasons that cause self-boasting, ujb, and I found that the most subtle of them is the self-boasting through one's understanding and knowledge. He said, al-ujb bil-fahm. One has self-boasting because they understand something. And this is the most subtle of the ujb. So in other words, when Habib Umar confirmed, and this would basically mean that in their view, the most subtle disease of the heart is to have a sense of self-pride or self-boasting because you have good understanding of something. This is the most difficult spiritual disease to pinpoint. Imagine a subject that you had studied for 10, 20, 30 years. And then someone speaks about that subject in front of you. Very, very difficult to say, I don't know, or I don't understand. Or not to realize that you have a sense of self-boasting because of that. So never feeling too proud to say, I don't know. So people now usually again, because of social media and because of what happens on social media, everyone is kind of triggered to speak about anything and everything, and to have an opinion about everything as well. And this is something that you need to be aware of when you're raising your children as well. This is something that children need, it has to be inculcated in children, right? And also they have to see it in the parents, right? When your child asks you a question, you don't know the question, say I don't know, especially if it's a religious question. It doesn't take away from you if your child asks you a question about Allah and you say I don't know. It doesn't take from you, right? It becomes problematic if you give the wrong answer. That becomes problematic, right? Focusing one's full attention on the questioner and carefully understanding their question. And this is something I've experienced, whether with Habib Ali or other teachers of mine, that they would allow you to ask the question fully, to the point that they would not start replying except after they ask, are you done? Or is there any other detail that you missed you want to include in your question? Are you done? Yes. And then they start answering. These three are very important. Accepting a sound argument, submitting to the truth, and returning to it when one errs. This is very difficult upon the lower self, because they all come to admitting a mistake. And Imam Shafi'i used to say, every time I debated someone, I wished that they would be the victorious one. You know why? Because he knew of himself that he can bear the defeat. He would have no problem to say, you're correct, I apologize. You're wrong, I concede. But he is worried that the other individual will not be able to do that with him. So every time he debates someone, he says, oh, I wish I lose. Why? I can concede, I have no problem with concession. My problem is that after debating with that individual, they would not concede. And if they don't concede to the truth, then they go against it. And this is usually why they never like to debate, out of their concern for the debater. Then he says it also includes preventing the student from pursuing knowledge that would be harmful to them. So this is like someone beginning in tasawwuf, and you tell them, come, let me speak to you about all of these sort of high realities, and let me teach to you Fusus al-Hikam by Sayyidi Muhyiddin al-Arabi. Or getting a beginner, for example, in fiqh, and tell them, okay, I'll teach you now the book Al-Umm by Imam al-Shafi'i. Or let me teach you Al-Hidayah in the Hanafi fiqh. Or let me teach you Al-Mughni by Imam ibn Qudama in comparative Hanbali fiqh, while they haven't finished in Arabic grammar the Ajurumiyya, which is the introductory manual. We have these examples nowadays of people delving into, so that when they say pursuing the knowledge that will be harmful to them, a harmful knowledge to a beginner is comparative fiqh, for example. Someone who never studied fiqh, and you teach them how comparative fiqh is done. Someone who never studied a text of creed, and you teach them advanced theology, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't have to be a science that is forbidden, so to speak. In other words, it doesn't have to be occult sciences. No, it could be just teaching them a level that is not, they're not up to it, and it harms them. And we have found, this is something that has been surveyed. Students are greatly affected by the very first books they read. And we had confessions from some shuyukh in Egypt, from the Salafi movement. After a while, they said, we were mistaken. When they grew old, they said, we were mistaken. One of them, rahimahullah, made a confession. He said, I was wrong in my approach. I read at the beginning of my readings a comparative fiqh book titled Al-Muhalla. This is by Imam Ibn Hazm. And Imam Ibn Hazm, he mentioned about himself in other books, I think he was diabetic or something, and he was very aggressive. So he would say things like, oh, this hadith is narrated by Tirmidhi, we don't know who the Tirmidhi is. Like that. Right? Very, very aggressive in a sense. So this Shaykh rahimahullah, the first thing that he read was Al-Muhalla. So in his initial writings, and he was focused on the science of hadith, in his initial writings, he differed in an opinion over the authenticity of a hadith with the Shaykh of Imam al-Bukhari. His name is Imam Ali ibn Madini. So in a published book but then he apologized afterwards and he said, I was not supposed to say that. But he said in a published book, he said, the chains of narrations are not analyzed and are not deemed unauthentic in that way, O Ibn al-Madini. Like that. So this type of approach happens when the student reads, the very first exposure in the tradition is a book of comparative theology, comparative fiqh. It speaks to a certain mind and to a certain soul, to a certain disciplined soul as well. So if you get the beginner into comparative fiqh, comparative theology, you're like throwing them in, in the midst of a storm, basically. He says, rebuking them if they seek beneficial knowledge for any purpose other than the face of Allah. This is the opinion of Imam Ghazali. Sayyidi Muhyiddin al-Arabi differs in his approach of spirituality, and he would say, you don't rebuke the student when you see, even if you see that they're seeking the knowledge not for the sake of Allah. Right? And that eventually or inevitably, they will walk away from that intention. Some of the pious predecessors, they said, we sought knowledge not for the sake of Allah, and knowledge did not submit to us until we sought it for the sake of Allah. So that was the different approaches in tarbiyah. And then he says, and withholding from engaging in communal obligations before completing the personal obligations. He's speaking to the scholars. And this is something that is applicable to everyone, actually, not just scholars. He says, and the scholar's obligation is to rectify both his outward and inward states through taqwa, to begin by holding himself accountable to taqwa. Allah. He says, and the scholar's personal obligation is to rectify both his outward and inward states through taqwa, to be accountable to taqwa, so that the student may follow first in his actions and only thereafter benefit from his words. Sayyidi Ibn Ata al-Sakandari radiallahu ta'ala anhu, just to kind of smooth the transition for the next class to speak about the etiquettes of the student, Sayyidi Ibn Ata al-Sakandari, in one of his aphorisms, he says, take the companionship of the one that benefits you through his state before his words. And Imam Ghazali, in this book earlier on, at the very beginning of the book, he says that people follow actions and imitate the actions more than the words. And most of you here, mashallah, you come with your children, you would find your children, they imitate your actions more than they would follow your verbal commands. They would do like what you do rather than they would necessarily follow what you're saying by words. So this is one of the key aspects related to a scholar. Let me add an etiquette here that I heard from Habib Ali the emphasis of. Before I traveled from Egypt to Malaysia, by about a week or so, I attended a gathering of Khatm of Sahih al-Imam al-Bukhari upon Habib Hussein Mudihaj, and it was in the presence of Shaykh Usama Elazhary. It was hosted by Habib Ali Jifri, presence of Shaykh Ali Jum'ah, Shaykh Usama, and so on and so forth. So Shaykh Ali Jum'ah, when he was given the mic to speak, he referred to Shaykh Usama in his talk. He said, just like Sayyidina Shaykh Usama said, our master Shaykh Usama said, and he's his student. So when Habib Ali had the concluding word, he said, I just want to point out to a rare etiquette, which is the teacher praising his student and referring to him in such words of respect and honor in the presence of everyone. And then I traveled to Malaysia. Shaykh Ahmed Mamdouh was invited to a recital of Sahih Muslim after Sahih Bukhari, to Sahih Muslim, and he was asked to give the first lecture, the introductory lecture to Sahih Muslim. And then I saw Shaykh Nuruddin al-Banjari from Indonesia, and he studied with some great scholars in Mecca. And he was one of the teachers of Shaykh Ahmed Mamdouh, that when he was in Cairo, Shaykh Ahmed Mamdouh read with him. So when it came the time for the lecture of Shaykh Ahmed Mamdouh, he sat by a pole and wrote a notebook and then started writing after Shaykh Ahmed, like a student would do. And he's probably in his 70s, right? And writing after Shaykh Ahmed Mamdouh. And I took a photo of that because it was so symbolic. And subhanAllah, I thought this etiquette of teachers with students, this sort of action is what allows the students afterwards, when they become scholars, to credit other people, to say, oh, I benefited from so-and-so, because they saw the teachers treating them as if they are the teachers. And it is mentioned, to conclude, it is mentioned in the biography of the great Imam Taqiyuddin al-Subki of the 8th Hijri century. His son narrated that when he would hear something related to the knowledge and the sacred sciences from a student, so a student would come to him and say, Shaykh, I read this statement in this book, I found this benefit in that book. He says he would have already knew it, but he would not like to break the heart of the student who say, oh, subhanallah, jazakallah khair, mashallah, very good, beautiful. And he had already known about it years ago. But he would not break the heart of the student, but rather acknowledge the good work of the student. So inshallah, next week,